you. Thanks.
We don't go, please, to Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Ciara. Thank you, Darrell and Niall, for being here. There's a lot going on in the House the last 2 weeks, so it's a busy time. And you came in on the sunniest of days, isn't it? Just from a guy who has studied business, and the Irish Stock Exchange was part of the business course, even for Leaving Cert and beyond. Based on your statement, the key issue doesn't seem to be access to finance. It seems to be that Irish companies, they aren't choosing Irish markets. And I still remember Éireann being, the IPO, and we were all going to make millions out of it. And, after that, I think IPO in Ireland became a bad word. So I'm just wondering, we've produced global countries like Ryanair, like Kingspan, but what has changed over the last decade or so that means scaling companies from Ireland are now looking elsewhere? They're not choosing our home turf.
I think that there's a few things there. So I think when you look across markets generally and the numbers of IPOs, globally today versus 20 years ago, there's less IPOs today. And I suppose what's different is, we've moved to a passive investment world, but also, whereas before private equity would take a stake in a company and after maybe 3-4 years would exit, what we're seeing is that there's more rounds of private equity. So private equity will buy a company or a stake in a company from private equity, and that pushes up the valuation. So I suppose there's stronger in terms of competition for IPO. Private equity is a stronger competitor in the space. Having said that, we have many fantastic companies in Ireland that would be prime candidates for IPO, and being able to use the markets, to do their fundraising, but then also tap the markets on an ongoing basis. So I think there's a real opportunity for us to promote public equity markets more. But in order to do that, we need to address the absence of features that exist in other European markets that don't exist here in Ireland. So the things that we've spoken about, the Cornerstone Fund, tax incentives for founders of companies, and then personal investment accounts to bring retail investment into the market. Because having those elements just makes markets more attractive and accessible for smaller companies in particular. I think the other thing that's changed is historically Irish companies, because I suppose the Irish and UK markets were so connected, Irish companies, when they listed, they'd list in Dublin and list in London as well. I think after Brexit...
Darrell, I was about to ask that, sort of my next question, so you sort of started. Has Brexit affected ourselves in that area?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of factors. So absolutely, I think Brexit has had an impact. But the other thing is that after the Irish Stock Exchange joined Euronext is very much a European model. So now, and because we've the same offering in terms of equity market listings that the other Euronext markets have, and the fact that we've introduced more markets for companies to give them more choice. So we would expect the dynamic these days to be, if you're an Irish company and you want to access public markets, that everything that Euronext Dublin offers will be sufficient for your needs, that you don't need to go down the road of a dual listing. Now, for some companies, they'll want to do that, and that's absolutely fine, and we'll accommodate that. But I think that it's a different dynamic today than it was pre-Brexit.
Yeah, sorry, I was also just going to say other things that might make it more attractive is we've increased the level of advisors that can work with companies and bring them to these new markets that we've introduced. So we've introduced a market for SMEs called Access, so very much targeting companies at that kind of 10, 20 million euro valuation. So we have a set of advisors, international advisors, who are keen to work with Irish companies and bring them to the market. So our advisor headcount increased from 5 to 10 last year. So we're expecting that to kind of follow through as well. And then there's a number of other measures we've made on our side about simplifying our rule books, harmonising them across Europe, but getting rid of some of the gold plating to make it more attractive, and in light of other initiatives that are happening at a European level, such as the Listing Act. Okay. Those items.
Can I ask you, now just you say you're talking in the statement about retaining headquarters, talent, intellect, you'll probably keep it all in Ireland. But I'm just wondering, have we already lost companies because our capital markets, they're just not competitive enough for those companies?
Well, I don't think it's probably fair to say that it's not competitive from the point of view of we've grown really large-scale companies out of Ireland who been listed traditionally on the Irish Stock Exchange and Euronext Dublin. So we've grown companies to be 20, 30 billion. They've had global investor bases. And if you look at a typical shareholder register of a company that's listed, it will have probably 30 to 40% will be ultimately US investors, 20 to 30% will be UK investors, and about 30% will be European investors. So that's a typical. So a listing is a global listing. So we are attracting capital from everywhere. So I think we have the competitive tool set there to attract global investors. And I think some of the companies that have moved in the past have been very maybe US-centric business models, and that has been one of the reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'd compliment what Niall is saying just by saying that within markets, and we've always experienced this, and all markets do, so you've got new companies coming to the market, but you also have delistings because companies will be taken private, or there'll be different corporate events that lead to a company leaving a market for perfectly legitimate business reasons, and that's just part and parcel of it. The real issue for us we never like to see any company leave the market, but the issue for us has been that we haven't had that pipeline of companies coming through, and it comes back to...
And is that not because of our populations that, Ireland is small?
There's a combination of factors, but I think it's, when we look at the types of companies that are starting up here, and accessing venture capital and seed capital, etc. There's some fantastic, high growth companies in our economy, but to get those companies to kind of move to the next phase using public markets, as I've mentioned, like when we look at other Euronext markets, the things that work well there, we don't have in the Irish market. And we've done the bits that we can do in terms of, revising our rule book, streamlining them, making it more, more streamlined and less costly for companies to join our markets. But it is those features that are the subject of our asks of government, which we believe will actually make a difference in terms of getting more companies to fund their growth through public markets and remain wedded to Ireland.
Can I ask you, Irish pension funds, are they investing in Irish growth companies, or are they doing more? If not, from what I'm hearing, they're not. But what is preventing that?
I was going to say there probably isn't the same home bias that there might be in other countries. So, as Darrell alluded to earlier, the likes of Bank of Ireland Asset Management, AIB Investment Managers, they have been subsumed into more global entities, and the movement has been to kind of passive investment rather than active investment over the last 10, 15 years. So again, that is kind of tying into a more kind of global, and then as you say, from a population and economy size, we're quite small in that global remit. So I think what we would love to see, the cornerstone fund would replace the lack of domestic institutional investors, because if you look at some other markets that we see, such as the UK, such as France, such as some of the Nordic countries, there's a very regional or home bias from domestic
often it's never accepted in their hometown. Can I ask you now, I think AI, online activity, technology has radically transformed the sector, and even on my own phone you've trading 212, you're keeping an eye on, so we've all become experts. I presume that has radically transformed Euronext.
In terms of AI or the trading methodologies?
Trading, everything's online now. You remember before we used to have to go over to Davies, and then they'd have your paper share certificates, all of that.
Yeah, so I think, with the Euronext model, so we provide the trading platform, and we've got, international firms that are connected to it. So just to give you an example of the scale of this, so we had 21 trading firms connected to the Irish Stock Exchange trading system before we joined Euronext, and after we joined Euronext, we've 36 trading firms today. So we've had more firms join, and from a secondary markets perspective, being part of Euronext has been massively successful, and what we've seen is liquidity shift. So the majority of trading in Irish shares takes place here on Euronext Dublin. And we've seen, in fact, recently a number of companies, they've looked at their listing arrangements and they've concentrated their listing here in Dublin because it reflects the reality that the vast majority of their trading already takes place here anyway.
Okay, last question. Have you any good stocks you'd recommend for my pension?
Thank you. To say still on that.
Every so often, I think Senator McCarthy brings a sparkle of brilliance at your committee.